So today I'm going to be criticizing the work of Donald Hoffman. And Donald Hoffman is a cognitive scientist who feels that his work has led him to the realization that everything that we see, everything that we hear, everything that we experience in life is an illusion. That the world that we see isn't what he calls what is referred to as a homomorphism. That is, it doesn't participate in a one-to-one relationship with the outside world. I've done at least a few videos criticizing Donald Hoffman. I have a number of specific reasons for disagreeing with him. Um, but in the comments section, people have been like, wow, why do you, have it out so badly for him? Why don't you put up your own ideas instead of, throwing stones at the work of a great man? Um, I have put out my own work, but my name in the algorithm isn't nearly as popular as Donald Hoffman. So when I put out my own ideas, it doesn't show up nearly as much as when you do a reaction video to somebody else's work. But I have discovered what I believe to be the fatal flaw, the mistake that he's made that's led him to the wrong conclusions. And I keep seeing him show up, and he's interviewed and basically gives the same interview every time. And he's being interviewed by some very intelligent people, but nobody seems to have realized the wrong turn that he took that, throws everything off. So I'm going to take another attempt at explaining exactly the mistake that he's made and why, once you understand that and make a simple switch out, that everything goes in a different direction. But, one of the ways that I judge philosophy is not just the truth or falsity of what somebody's saying, because often that can't be definitively proven. I judge a philosophy by a person's ability to live by that philosophy. I judge the philosophy by the person's ability to act, speak, talk, think, expect in congruence with the philosophy that they're professing. It's one of many reasons why I could never be a determinist, because if I were a determinist, there would be all these things then that would flow from that I'm just not capable of doing. Guys like Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky can go very hardcore on determinism, but they can't live as though determinism were the truth. And so just right there, it's like, something's amiss. And so when somebody like Donald Hoffman takes his authority as well established, well respected, um, PhD, went to MIT, he takes all that authority and he brings it in the social sphere, and then he starts telling people that everything that they see is an illusion. He needs to be very careful with that, because if he's wrong, his authority is still going to convince a great many people. And what are you going to do with that core belief that everything you see is an illusion, right? Even if you think you can pigeonhole it, even if you think you can apply that where it suits you and forget it where it doesn't, it's still going to be in the background, right? And we see a lot of that now on the internet, and we wonder why culture's going astray and why people, can't get together, and, why there's this crisis of meaning, and even why people are just choosing not to have kids. Well, if you go on YouTube and someone eminent like um, Donald Hoffman tells you that there's no way that you can see actual reality and everything that you see is in some sense false, everything you see is an illusion. Well, that would be your children, that would be your wife, your husband, your lover. That would be every poem you've ever read, every movie you've ever seen, every flower you've ever smelled. There's a truth there that you can't get to. And so that would be my initial motivation. Now, I'm not saying just because a theory leads to an ugly conclusion that it's not true or that we shouldn't pursue it. But I do think we should be extra careful to make sure that everything we have done has led logically to that conclusion. And so I have discovered what I believe to be the fatal flaw in his work. And actually, I believe by making this one change, you could even use his work. You change this one thing, but you use his work, and all of a sudden, everything we see is an illusion. Everything we see is participating in reality, but we as individuals perhaps are a lower order, a nested infinity, and I'll get into explaining this, that still is able to participate with the larger infinity. So, I'm just going to share my screen here. So, this is one of the last interviews that Daniel Dennett did. This is with Brian Keating. And in this interview, he calls Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky, he accuses them of high class social vandalism. And so, in a very real sense, that's what I'm accusing Donald Hoffman of. I was actually quite surprised to find out that Daniel Dennett believed in free will. I just would assume that if anybody was going to be a determinist, it would be Daniel Dennett. I had problems with Daniel Dennett going way back to my days in college, all the way back in the early 90s, when he came out with a book called Consciousness Explained, where he believed that he could just explain away consciousness as a product of computation, basic algorithm. He was also even called himself an evolutionary philosopher. Um, and so when I found out, just in the last 6 months, it's not like I've been following his career, continually over all that time. I was shocked to find out that he was um, a free will proponent, even though I believe that that's inconsistent with everything else that he argues for, and that compatibilism is, lack of a better term, just BS from the start. Um, Either we are machines, either we are the product of random events, or there is something different about us that transcends that. And I don't think there's any way to get from where he starts to where he wants to finish, which is free will. I've covered that in other videos. But this high class social vandalism that I also would accuse Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky of is the same sort of thing that I'm accusing uh, Donald Hoffman of. So forgive me for a little digression here before I get to the root of what's wrong with Donald Hoffman's theory. But, if somebody were to ask you, what's something interesting about you? What's something that makes you different? I would be probably the first person in America and probably the third person worldwide to speak out against the problem of blinding headlights. Indulge me here. I moved out to LA from Chicago in 2010. In Chicago, I didn't own a car. I lived in the heart of the city, took a lot of public transportation, taxis, occasionally rented a car if I needed it. I moved out in 2010 to LA, where you got to have a car just to survive. Started driving around, and I was noticing everybody with these what I thought were their high beams, and then I realized very quickly that these weren't high beams; these were HID headlights. And at that time, it was mostly just on like Mercedes and Audis, but I saw very clearly these are just headlights. They're on the premium cars now, but before long, they're going to be on all cars. And before long, driving is going to be unbearable. So that's me 8 years ago on this is KCAL News, but the original interview was with CBS News in New York. And I had started a petition to call attention to the problem of blinding headlights. Back then it was HIDs, now it's LEDs, and it's just getting, worse day by day. when I started that petition, most people thought I was crazy. Again, I'm like literally the first person in an organized way out of a country of 340 million people to speak about it. And as far as I know, I was able to get in touch with a guy in England who had worked with a London cabbie, and they had a little website going about it. So I was like literally the third person worldwide to speak about it. But time has proven me right. That petition that I started, I've given it to somebody else who's more organized. But that petition I started now has 62,863 votes. It's on change.org. Ban blinding headlights and save lives. This is a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. You can see those headlights there. And it says America's drivers agree LED headlights are just too bright. And this is from the Telegraph. This is in England. Dazzling headlights are ruining your journeys. Here's what can be done, right? And it says 9 out of 10 drivers say glare bothers them. So in 8 years, I've gone from being a crank, a quack, to now 9 out of 10 people agree with what I've said. I feel slightly validated there. What I found interesting was just, I don't know how I came upon it, but a book on automotive lighting and human vision came out in 2007, has as a co-author, let's see if I can find it here, Donald D. Hoffman. So, in his role as a cognitive scientist who understands the visual system, et cetera, he got together with 3 other scientists and wrote this book on automotive lighting and human vision. Now, it is $102 and like 400 pages long. So, no, I have not read it. I read the introduction here, which was I was able to find with a PDF. It's just the first 30 pages. But Mr. Donald Hoffman, with all his mathematical models and all his colleagues, were not able to identify the problem that I saw with my own eyes just 3 years later. That regardless of what your mathematical models are telling you, regardless with how much you understand the exterior physical fact of the brain and the nervous system and lighting and the whole thing, you are clearly missing the truth, which is that these headlights blind and they hurt. And I'll show you why that matters right here. This is actually a great YouTube channel. It's called Not Just Bikes, and it's about how we can engineer better, more humane, livable societies, cities. And it's, I guess, from a biker's perspective, somebody who rides bikes around town, you know, how we can uh, improve everyone's lives by making our streets and our cities more humane. And here you have U.S. pedestrian fatalities. And this is 2010. That's about right where I started to notice the problem. And as I started to speak out, look what's happened. U.S. pedestrian fatalities are up 77% in the last 10 years. And I know you know what I'm talking about because when you drive at night, now now the days are getting shorter and so the lights are getting brighter. It's just common sense. Yes, bright headlights can help us see, but they can also blind us. That is, if we were just driving on dark roads by ourselves, we'd want to shine as much light as possible. But since we share the roadways with others, when we're shooting that light into each other's eyes, now we can't see anything, especially when we're at intersections and people are crossing. If our eyes are flooded with light, we can't see the pedestrians, they get hit. And so now we have a 77% increase in pedestrian fatalities. Our overall roadway fatalities are at record highs as well. So, that's just to point out that just because somebody's an expert and just because they have mathematical models and just because they have, you know, authority doesn't mean that they're necessarily right. And so if Donald Hoffman, with all his mathematics, missed this, what else might he miss? Is my point. And I just, couldn't help but find it, you know, interesting that here's this guy I'd been pushing back against with some of my philosophy videos. And it turns out that he had a chance to, affect this trend and clearly called it wrong. I mean, there's chapter headings in there. It's clear that, there's trade-off for, how far you can see and the glare. I mean, I've talked to the experts in this field, and so many of them would have been referencing this book. And it all came down to, well, we trade the extra distance we can see for the extra glare, and we feel that the extra distance justifies the glare. Well, guess what? It does not. 9 out of 10 people agree with me. Might have a little grudge there, just pointing out what can go wrong if you trust your math more than you're able to trust your own experience. So here is his paper. This is, where it's all coming from. Fact, fiction, and fitness. When you see him on Lex Fridman, when you see him on Theories of Everything, what I have highlighted here is the core of his theory, and it's where he is making his fatal mistake. And so I'm just going to read it. He says, we ask whether the payoff functions that drive evolution by natural selection are homomorphisms of these structures. We prove in each case that generically the answer is no. As the number of world states and payoff values go to infinity, the probability that a payoff function is a homomorphism goes to zero. We conclude that natural selection almost surely shapes perceptions of these structures to be non-veridical. This is consistent with the interface theory of perception, which claims that natural selection shapes perceptual systems not to provide veridical perceptions, but to serve as species-specific interfaces that guide adaptive behavior. Our results present a constraint for any theory of consciousness which assumes that structure in perceptual experience is shaped by natural selection. So it's very short. That is like literally all you need to know about what he's saying, but it's of course filled with a lot of technical jargon. And, again, I've been shocked when, I just discovered Donald Hoffman, was watching his content, was disturbed by his conclusions, hated the way that this was going to play out in, mass culture and mass consciousness. No, it wasn't enough for me just to disagree. I didn't understand why I disagreed. So I found his paper and I read it. And this was literally one of those things that came to me as I was dozing off to sleep. I said, I see. This is the fatal flaw. So let me walk through this, partial paragraph here, and I'll do my best to explain that. We ask whether the payoff functions that drive evolution by natural selection are homomorphisms of these structures. Okay, so what's a payoff function? A payoff function would be anything that an organism does that gives it selective advantage. If you read down, it actually gets ridiculous. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of evolution. When you start to question evolution, far too many people will just shut you off. So just so you know, I believe, yes, that things evolve. No, I do not believe that they evolve by natural selection. Um, there's a big difference there, and there's a serious conflation that scientists repeatedly engage in to the point that it really amounts to propaganda. Somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, if he, I'm sure he said this 1,000 places. Oh, evolution is a fact. Tucker Carlson, whom I do not like, went on Joe Rogan and said, "Oh, evolution's been disproved," and I'm sure I've seen somewhere that Neil deGrasse Tyson took him down. No, that's bullshit. Okay, here's what they're doing there. The fact that things evolve has been proven. Yes. Just a simple look at the archaeological record, the fossil record will show that. Life starts out on this planet as single-celled organisms, becomes multi-celled organisms. In the Cambrian explosion, all of a sudden animals show up, and it's clear that life is building on life. Life comes from life, right? Things evolve. I have no qualms that a distant ancestor of mine is an ape. That's okay. I agree, yes, that things evolve. But how they evolve, that random mutations being acted on by natural selection are sufficient to get us to eyes and brains and, you know, hyper complexity, I take issue with that. So the fact that Donald Hoffman even begins with, natural selection as this established fact is problematic. But, I understand that when I start to make that argument, far too many people will just shut me off. So let's just assume that even the natural selection part is fine. It's just saying a payoff function is anything, any action, any mechanism that an organism can take to reach out into the exterior world and, let's say, just get a calorie. All right. Homomorphisms. What is a homomorphism? Well, if somebody comes to your front door and they ring the doorbell, that lets you know that somebody's at the front door. But that doorbell is not a homomorphism of the person that's at the front door. But if you have a ring cam and they ring the doorbell and you look at your phone and you get a small little compressed, maybe slightly grainy video, that's not a perfect image of the person who's at your front door, but that is a homomorphism of the person that's at your front door. Actually, Jordan Peterson interviewing Donald Hoffman really helped me understand what that is, because he was really pushing back against Donald Hoffman on this point. And I've always found Jordan Peterson's interview style funny, because he's actually a horrible interviewer because he loves to hear himself talk. But in this case, it really helped because he wasn't just taking Donald Hoffman's word for everything. He was really trying to think through his points. And one of the things that he said was that a Simpsons character, so the Simpsons will have guest stars on, and, you know, let's say they have, Arnold Schwarzenegger on. Well, they already have that with Wolfgang, Rainier Wolfcastle. Um, but you can see the homomorphism in Rainier Wolfcastle, his clear relationship to uh, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or when they had the Red Hot Chili Peppers on. These aren't the real Red Hot Chili Peppers. These are just cartoon characters, but you look at them and you know immediately that that is supposed to be the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and that's true of every, famous guest star that they've had on the show. So this relationship between the real thing and the Simpsons character, there is a homomorphism there. There is something that tracks. What he's saying is an organism has an interior reality. And then this is where he gets into the mystery of consciousness. And again, I don't think he really understands what he's saying, because he's sort of, like at a smorgasbord table of ideas, and he's mixing and matching things that don't go together. But he believes in consciousness, but he believes somehow evolution creates individual consciousnesses. I was arguing with somebody in the comment section on another video, and they're like, well, doesn't he believe in the one? I said, no, 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 no. He believes in the ones. He doesn't believe in consciousness as a whole consciousness. He believes in consciousness the way you might believe in steam engines, right? You put together the right elements in the right way, and they will create steam, and you'll have steam power. But each one of those is an individual thing. It doesn't take part in some field of steam, as others might say that everything that is conscious takes place in one conscious field, like there's some ground consciousness. So he's looking at individual organisms that evolution creates, builds up. How we handle that three-dimensional engineering, nobody ever wants to bother with, but whatever. And so, from the organism's perspective, there's an inside and an outside. And the transaction that the organism has with the outside is that payoff function. There's something on the outside that I need. If you read down into his paper, he talks about creatures and stuff. And he's got a funny way of spelling creature, and stuff is like STUPH. And it's like, so there's creatures and they need stuff, as if there's just this simple one-to-one relationship to building up organisms, which again, completely ignores the problem of irreducible complexity, but that's for another debate. So anytime an organism is able to reach out and get something and bring it back, that's a payoff function. The question is, as you stack those payoff functions, do they retain any homomorphism? Do they retain any relationship with the actuality of the outside? Or are they like that doorbell, right? Just imagine that an organism, all they have is the sound of a doorbell. All they have, their only payoff function is a doorbell. So it's ding dong, right? But that gets them something that gives them some selective advantage. Let's just say it gets them a calorie. And then they develop a payoff function for a fire alarm, right? When a fire alarm goes off, beep, 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 that's no homomorphism to fire and smoke, but it is a payoff function that if you hear that beep, 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 you can get away. So you have a doorbell ding dong, and that sends you towards calories. And you have beep, 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 that's the fire alarm, and that sends you away from danger. And so the stupendously overly simplified view of evolution, essentially, that as you stack these payoff functions, you get greater and greater complexities. But just as a doorbell in no way takes part in the person who's at the front door, or a fire alarm in no way takes part with fire and smoke, so all the payoff functions that we've developed in no way actually participate in the real deal. It goes on. So we ask whether the payoff functions that drive evolution by natural selection are homomorphisms of these structures. We prove in each case that generically the answer is no. And this is the biggie. This is the whole thing. This is his equation right here. As the number of world states and payoff values go to infinity, the probability that a payoff function is a homomorphism goes to zero. So that's a simple equation. And so anything you do on one side of the equation affects the other side of the equation. And this is where, the problem begins and where the problem can end. And so what he means by world states are literally not just the entire universe and all the particles within it, but the entire universe and all the ways that that universe could be ordered. So that is either infinite, or it is such a large number that it is approaching infinity. And within that universe, there are payoff values, there are configurations of matter that could give the organism a payoff function. But that number, though a lower order than the world states, still is something approaching infinity, right? So infinity is so large that, you know, um, all the numbers go to infinity, but all the numbers within that infinity are not prime, but prime numbers are also infinite. And so this is going to be important. These are, infinity is so large that there are orders of infinity within infinity that are still infinite themselves. So all the ways that the universe can be are infinite. And within that, all the ways that that universe could pay off for the organism are infinite. But the number of payoff functions are finite. Again, an organism, if we're materialists, It's just a certain number of atoms and molecules, and there are only so many configurations that that organism could rearrange those atoms and molecules. And so there's no way for them to track all those world states and all those payoff values. Therefore, as the world states and payoff values go to infinity, the payoff functions must shrink to zero. An example of how this works elsewhere, I was listening to a cosmologist, I forget, I think it was on a Lex Friedman podcast, but he was talking about massless particles. I didn't know there was such a thing as particles that had no mass. But what he said was because the particles have no mass, that means that their wave goes to infinity. And so that means that they're spread out across the entire universe. So that's the power of an equation. What happens on one side affects what happens on the other. And so if you have no mass, now excuse me, I think wave is the incorrect term, but it still holds. You get what I'm saying? It's I'm missing the actual term. Maybe somebody can put that in the comments for me. But as that particle goes to zero mass, its wave, it means that that particle itself then is infinitely spread across the universe. And so we just have to understand that what Donald Hoffman is saying, and then this is literally what he's then taking to every interview that he goes to. This is the big aha moment that there's no way for all our doorbells and all our fire alarms and every little other payoff function that we've evolved can track with that infinity. Therefore, there's no way that that collection of actions and mechanisms could give us a homomorphism of what's actually on the outside. So that's the whole thing. What I'm saying is he's made a fatal mistake in his root assumptions. Every organism, let's just say animals and forget everything else, is host to a consciousness. There's something it is like to be a beetle. There's something it is like to be a beaver. There's something that is like to be you and me. The body is finite. The consciousness, which Donald Hoffman admits exists and then goes on to make a whole, mystical enterprise out of, is infinite. That infinite consciousness is at the heart of those payoff functions. What that means is that he's studying the wrong thing. He's literally just taking any organism and comparing the infinity of possibilities on one side to the finite possibilities of any reorganization of that finite matter that could be reconfigured to represent that infinity. And since it's finite, his math has to shrink that down to zero. But it's not finite. It's half finite and it's half infinite. Perhaps more to the point, the body that the consciousness is using is finite, but the consciousness itself is infinite. Now, how can I prove that? I believe that Gödel's incompleteness theorems, that's their deepest meaning. You can look at my other videos. I have one, it's the debate actually between Daniel Dennett, Robert Sapolsky, but I bring Kurt Gödel into it. I did one, the one before this one called Gödel's Robot. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of infinity. And anytime you try to come up with a finite way, a mechanical way of answering the hard problem of consciousness, it breaks down because what you end up needing is an infinite mechanism to get that done. So that's my argument. If consciousness can do what would take an infinite machine to accomplish, then consciousness is in itself an infinite, it's a it's an infinity itself. And so I'm going to take it now to the next step. I would have loved to have been able to do this in real time, but I tried and Google, or sorry, YouTube hit me with a copyright infringement. But this is a documentary that's on Netflix and it's quite good. It's called A Trip to Infinity. And so they talk about all the, amazing and interesting things about the concept of infinity. But one of the things that they're talking about here, and again, I wish I could just play it for you, is this principle that if you have a perfect circle, that you can have a perfect circle of diameter 1. This is what this woman would be saying. And you could have a perfect circle of a diameter 1 billion, but a perfect circle is defined by having an infinite number of points on its circumference. So even if you have a circle that is just 1 inch in diameter, that perfect circle in reality is the same size as a circle that's 1 billion miles in diameter, for the reason of that you can track every point from the surface of the 1 inch circle to the surface of the 1 billion-mile wide circle. And so I'm just going to scrub through this and I think you'll get an idea of what I'm saying here. Here she's talking about the smaller circle and then the bigger circle. And there you have your circles. And so you're plotting them out, one on one side, one on the other. But look, all their points correspond. So there you go, your bigger circle and your larger circle. There's another mathematician. So they're both saying the same thing. And then you see how she's drawing out from that smaller circle to the bigger circle. And since they're both infinite, they both match up. And so even though we know one is smaller in size than the other, they are also the exact same size. You see how all those points match up? And so that's what I would offer Donald Hoffman and why I would bother to make a video like this. Because this seems obvious to me, but nobody ever brings it up when they're interviewing Donald Hoffman. What if you're modeling the wrong thing? What if conscious beings, we'll just say animals to keep it simple, aren't just limited to their atoms and molecules? What if the consciousness that that body is host to is in its own essence infinite, which, I believe Gödel's incompleteness theorems clearly establish? If that's the case, then that consciousness can draw an infinite number of correlations to the outside universe, and the payoff functions can track to the world states and the payoff values. There are certain things, yes, like the doorbell, that's going to let me know somebody's at the front door, but aren't the person at the front door. But when I go to the front door and I apprehend my best friend with my eyes and I hear him with my ears and I give him a hug and I feel him with my body, all of that is qualia. And qualia is an infinite problem. It's why they can't describe it. That's why they can't explain it. That's why they definitely can't put it into a machine. That's why Chat GPT and all that stuff will never be truly conscious, because it's an infinite task. But if I'm a lower order, if I'm a smaller order infinity inside this body, I can still have a homomorphic relationship with the outside world. And so I truly believe that if somebody was to take Donald Hoffman's mathematical models and swap out his limited organism for something like a perfect circle, something like a nested infinity, all of a sudden the homomorphisms would return. And his whole argument that we're, um, you know, hopelessly doomed to live inside these bodies and have no true relationship with the outside world would completely fall apart. The conclusions would be 180 to the conclusion that he's come to. And so, just to recap, there's no escaping that the conclusions that he's coming to are ugly. That the conclusions that he's coming to lead to a sense of hopelessness, a degradation in our existence and our relationship with the world, life, each other. If we can't see anything as it truly is, if everything that we see is an illusion, that's everything. That's, everybody we've ever loved, you know, every beautiful day that we've ever had. Um, everything that we do is touched by that thought. If people aren't willing to own that, if they're not willing to go all the way with that, well, that's their problem. That just makes them bad philosophers. I just judge people's philosophy not so much on the truth of what they're saying, because often we can't establish that. Can't establish, no, I think I could, but free will versus determinism, right? I can't disprove that determinism may actually be the case. But I know that I couldn't live as a determinist. And I know that if determinism were the case, they would have all these ramifications. And so it's not to say that I shouldn't believe in something because it's ugly or because I don't like it. But if it's going to have all these negative consequences, I better be doubly sure that I've taken the correct path to get there. And just as all his mathematical models and all his knowledge of neurons didn't allow him to see the truth about LED lights, even more so, a simple assumption, a simple incorrect assumption could lead to even further turmoil and pain culturally by a bunch of people walking around, well, nothing's real anyway, right? And I believe what I've shown here is exactly the point in his theory that needs the most interrogation. Why are you assuming that the thing that you are studying is a finite creature? What if it has an infinite dimension to it? And if it does, just as that smaller infinite circle can track with any infinite circle of any size, so our consciousness within our body can draw a point to anything in the universe and therefore keep those homomorphisms. And so when you see a mountain, yeah, that's what the mountain looks like. I don't live too far from the mountains outside of LA. I see them from a distance. Are those the real mountains? Yes, they're the real mountains. Yes, is that a homomorphism of the mountains? Yes, that's a homomorphism of the mountains. As I get closer to them, they gain detail, they gain size, they gain complexity till I'm right up on the thing, and then I can't even see the mountains anymore. And so, yeah, there's always going to be more beyond the horizon. I'm that smaller nested infinity in a much larger infinity that contains infinities, and who knows how far that goes. But as long as I'm infinite in my nature, and that is what consciousness is, and that's why it eludes all our attempts to put it into finite mathematics and computation. If I am truly infinite at my core, then yes, I can draw a point with any point in reality. I can keep pace and I can trust what I see. Is there more to it? Are there things beyond the color spectrum that I can't see, sounds I can't hear? Yes, but guess what? I know that I can't hear them. I know that I can't see them. How is it that I know that? How is it that I can interact with mathematics and you can't hold math? You can't see the Platonic forms and all that stuff. Anyway, so a guy who got LEDs wrong is maybe not the guy to pin your entire existence on either. And that's my argument. Take Donald Hoffman's work and just swap out the finite creature and put something like a perfect circle in its place. And I bet you get the exact opposite of the conclusions that he got originally.